The Ground You Stand Upon, Life of a Sky Trooper in Vietnam. Written by Joshua E. Bovee, Wilbur E. Bovee. Narrated by Will Stoff. 13 published books and several military reports were used as sources in this book. All of them are listed on the website, thegroundyoustandupon.org, under Sources. Also available on this website are the over 100 photographs featured in the print version of this book, organized by chapter. These photos were taken by Wilbur Bovee and fellow Alpha Company soldiers, Robert Matulik, Marvin Biersbach, Joe Sanchez, and others. Prologue. It is August 4th, 2017. As I begin to write this introduction, 50 years to the day since my father returned home from war. From August of 1966 to August of 1967, he lived and fought in the Central Highlands and coastal plains of Vietnam. How do you write a story about something that happened over 50 years ago? I graduated a mere 25 years ago. All I can remember about that day is listening to some people talk, and a nice lady in a maid outfit serving meatballs at my party afterward. Imagine trying to remember what happened on a particular day a half a century ago, especially if it's a day you just as soon forget. As one would expect, my dad remembers bits and pieces, images, high points, low points, friends made, and friends lost. When I began writing this book, I wanted to fill in the blank spaces, depicting exactly where my dad and his friends were and what they did during their tour of Vietnam. Useful information was scarce, but I did stumble upon a map that documented the location of virtually every battalion in the 1st Air Cavalry Division on October 4th, 1966, the date of his company's first fatalities. As I studied the map, I soon found the military symbol indicating the location of 5th Battalion, 7th Cavalry, 57th Cav, my dad's battalion. Searching further, I found another symbol that indicated the location of his specific company, Alpha Company, 57th Cav, near what looked to be some kind of lake called Dam Not Not. All I knew from the books I had read was that Alpha Company had been sent to sweep the area eastward toward the sea, and at one point was sent to rescue a downed helicopter pilot. Emotions are funny things. I had read a few accounts about what happened that day, the personal story of the first Alpha Company trooper to fall and the young family he left behind. Compelling as it was, it didn't quite bring me to tears. But as I studied this obscure map with military symbols showing precisely where Alpha Company had made contact with the enemy that day, knowing what happened there, realizing this was the very spot in the world where my dad first watched his dead fellow soldiers being flown away on helicopters, this is when I cried. Through conversations with some of my dad's fellow sky troopers, I've come to realize that specific locations and dates aren't really all that important, not to them at least. For months, I've labored over how to describe places like the Bong Son and An Lao regions, Kon Tum and Binh Dinh provinces, Highway 19 and the various mountain ranges, all places I've only read about. Those who survived in these places, however, will tell you that a rice paddy is a rice paddy. The valleys, the mountains, the rivers and highways, they're all pretty much the same. The only thing that makes any of them special is what happened there. What they remember is their experience, the fear, the fleeting moments of joy and comfort, the bonds of brotherhood made, and the hardships of life in the infantry. When I was a kid, our family would turn out the lights, make a bowl of popcorn, set up the movie screen, and click through photographs on our Kodak carousel slide projector. Sometimes we would look at Dad's pictures from Vietnam. My favorite was the one of him wading through a sea of 6-foot-tall elephant grass, carrying his rifle, unshaven, cigarette dangling from his lips. This photo was curiously absent from the collection of now digitized photos he sent me when I started this project. I think he was embarrassed to have a picture of himself smoking. Clicking through each of the slides, he would mention the names of those in the pictures, which ones got killed, which ones made it. I never thought much about these unrecognizable faces, who they were before being sent to war, who they were to my dad. All I knew about the pictures was that they were from somewhere in Vietnam between 1966 and 1967. What I knew about Dad's experience was that he was drafted and sent there on a boat. It was really hot, he got shot at, had some friends who were killed, and got a rock lodged in his arm that never came out. And by the way, it sucked. Like so many others, my father did his duty when called upon. For most of my life, That was all I needed to know. The rest of the story, that of Alpha Company, 5/7th Cav, has since resided only in the fading memories of my dad and the men he served with. But what a tragedy it would be if that story were never told. My hope is for their loved ones to see this war through my dad's eyes and learn something more about what they did there and what they went through. Although there were many pitched battles, it is not a tale of glory, nothing akin to the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima, as it were, although there are Bronze Star, Silver Star, and Distinguished Service Cross citations attesting to the valor of several of the men of Alpha Company. It is largely a story of drudgery, deprivation, and of walking through jungles and rice paddies waiting to get shot at. There is pain, death, and regret. It is also, however, a story of courage. Aside from the harrowing acts of valor, it is principally the daily acts of courage that I hope to convey. The courage to rise from the dirt each morning and continue the patrol. The courage to obey. The courage to simply show up. To my knowledge, there are no books specifically about Alpha Company, 5/7th Cav, that have been published. This will be the first, forming a coherent timeline of events, bringing to life the young men of Alpha Company, describing the life of an infantryman in the Central Highlands. These things present a monumental challenge for someone who has never been to Vietnam, or been to war for that matter. Unqualified as I am, I hope to do their story justice. The National Archives website maintains a record of all service members killed in the Vietnam War. Pulling together the names and dates of deaths of those in Alpha Company, 5/7th Cav, provided a starting point for research. It quickly illustrated those months and those days that were the toughest for Alpha Company. November 19th and 24th, 1966, along with May 19th, 1967, stood out as particularly dark days for the company. I searched several military memorial websites where fellow soldiers, family members, and hometown friends have posted their personal memories of those lost in Vietnam. I even stumbled across a posting my dad had left back in 2001 in remembrance of one of his buddies. Some of these people posted their email addresses, and I attempted to contact each of them. Many were kind enough to share their personal memories and backgrounds of the fallen. I'd like to thank each of them for their willingness to help. I have listed these generous people in the acknowledgement section at the end of this book, noting each of their contributions. There were 3 books written by former infantrymen of the 5/7th Cav that were of great assistance. In 1994, Captain Bernard E. Grady, retired, published On the Tiger's Back, his own recollections of his time spent as Bravo Company's executive officer, then later as commander of Charlie Company. Another book was published in 2009, 1966, The Year of the Horse, by Robert K. Powers. Drafted around the same time, both of them grunts, both mortarmen, the experiences of Robert Powers and my dad were very similar. Like my father, Powers also became an electrician after the war. Both books recount the tragic events of Thanksgiving Day, 1966. Bernard Grady provided a possible explanation for why Alpha Company soldiers would go for months on end without a change of clothing. In one chapter, he relates a story about how he came to know Father Tom Whittle and what would become the battalion chaplain's second job, serving in sister companies to Alpha. Both Powers and Grady fought in many of the same battles, and their accounts helped me determine where Alpha Company was at certain times throughout their tour. Sadly, both Bernard Grady and Robert Powers have since passed. If I could, I would thank them for what they wrote. A third book was written in 2007 by Joe Sanchez of Alpha Company, 5/7th Cav, True Blue, A Tale of the Enemy Within. It is primarily about his experience as a cop in New York City, but also includes several recollections of his time in Vietnam and the friends he made there. Aside from what he wrote in the book, he also shared with me many additional memories from both Fort Carson and Vietnam that added greatly to the story I have to tell about Alpha Company. He also helped my dad and me connect with a few additional Sky Troopers from the company. Thank you, Joe, for all of that. One such trooper that Joe put me in touch with is Robert Matulik, who was their company's communications sergeant during their tour. We spoke for several hours on the phone. Now, well into his 80s, he has an amazingly detailed memory of their many battles fought together. Those memories helped me to paint far more compelling and accurate portraits of their company's most harrowing events. Also of great assistance was Don Shipley. He was assigned to Charlie Company in the same battalion. He is now the Vice President of Membership for the 5/7th Cavalry Association, a group of veterans from their old battalion who reunite every couple years. So why hasn't Will been to any of our reunions? Was his first question for me. Like a shepherd searching for his lost sheep, he has dedicated much of his time to bringing wayward Sky Troopers back into the fold and reconnecting them with their buddies. He and his colleagues in the association have been largely successful in their efforts over the years. Much thanks is due to my loving wife, Misty, who encouraged me to finish this project since it began over a year ago, and who has shown great patience and understanding as I have virtually been in another world throughout this process. In reading the final draft of this book, I realized that I had forgotten to thank my mom, Carol. Sorry to say, but that would be typical of me. I suppose we sometimes take for granted all the love and support of those who are always there for us. My mom accompanied my dad and me on our journey to the National Archives, spending long days scanning documents during our research there, while spending each night at College Park, Maryland's finest Super 8 motel. She also helped to proofread several drafts of the entire book. When I was in grade school, I had aspirations of being an author, and she had always wanted me to write a book. So thank you, not just for all that, but for helping and supporting both me and my brother, Nick, through all of the changes and challenges in both of our lives. Most of all, I want to thank my dad for being willing to relive what could easily be considered the worst year of his life. In doing so, he's had to try to remember a lot of things that he would probably rather forget. I also want to thank him for all the letters and photographs he sent home from the war zone. Both have enabled me to bring this story to life in a way that would have otherwise been impossible. In fact, at least half of this book was written by him, in his own words, over 50 years ago. When I started talking to him about this project, I asked if he still had those letters, most of which were written to his mother. Although he still had them, he said that the letters didn't really say much about what they were doing, and that they were really quite boring. Apparently, he had started reading them once and quickly fell asleep. After most of this book was written, or so I thought, I finally got around to asking if I could see them. He gave me a cardboard box filled with letters still in their original envelopes, bound in rubber bands, all in chronological order. There were over 100 letters. I should have known better, as my dad always tends to understate things. His communiques were sent from some of the most remote valleys and outposts in Vietnam, written under the most austere of conditions, often scribbled in haste before another mission, or by flashlight under a poncho in the rain. They would travel over 8,000 miles across the ocean to be placed in a mailbox that stood across from a farmhouse along a rural county road in Wisconsin. Reading each of his letters from beginning to end was the closest I will ever come to time travel. His dispatches answered many questions as to where he and his company were and what they did throughout their year in Vietnam. They provided one answer in particular that I had been desperately searching for. It had to do with their mission on October 4th, 1966, the date of Alpha Company's first fatalities, and their additional task of rescuing that downed pilot. I had corresponded with the daughter of one of the men killed that day. We exchanged whatever information we had, but neither of us knew if they had been successful in rescuing the pilot or not. My dad couldn't remember anything in particular about that day, nor could anyone else that I had spoken to until then. His letters revealed that their company had actually rescued 2 pilots that day. I was happy to share this news with someone for whom it meant so much. During their time spent training at Fort Carson, the letters illustrated how utterly in the dark he and his buddies were about their fate. Rumors were their main source of information and would continue to be so throughout their tour in Vietnam. Most importantly, the letters provided a window into who my dad was at this point in his life. Throughout this process, I had tried to keep in mind how young he was and how different he may have been from the man I've always known. You see, my dad is universally considered a rather responsible and straight-laced fellow, a man who never drinks too much and hasn't touched a cigarette since before I was born. A pillar of reliability. He worked for over 30 years as a maintenance electrician at a local factory, and I can recall how each morning his lunch pail sat waiting for him on our kitchen counter, sandwich and apple inside. As I read the first of his letters from Fort Carson, where he trained for war, it all hit me like a ton of bricks. He was just a kid. His concerns were that of a typical 20-year-old, Cars, girls, drinking and having fun, in pursuit of which he wasn't afraid to break the rules. And he was jazzed to become what was known as a sky trooper, flying into battle with a historic cavalry unit once led by General Custer. He even drew a picture of their Australian bush hat in a letter so his little brother could see what it looked like. He may have been a bit embarrassed by the adolescent nature of some of the comments he made in his letters, not to mention some of the stunts he pulled. Then again, what grown adult wouldn't be embarrassed by a weekly recounting of all their thoughts and aspirations from when they were 20 years old? Had I kept a diary at that age, I would no doubt be mortified by it now and loath to share it with anyone. But these are the things that give the story life, that make it real. The letters paint a portrait of a young man, anxious to make his family proud, and utterly unprepared for the inglorious reality of this new war. He wrote at length about that first pitched battle they had fought on October 4th, asking his family if they had heard about Operations Thayer and Irving on the news. Entering into their third straight month of search and destroy missions. However, his recounting of their battles became vague and eventually all but non-existent. It's telling that he remembers nothing about the battle he wrote the most about, but wrote nothing about the one battle he still remembers so vividly, that of Thanksgiving Day, 1966. The letters also portray a mother who is desperately concerned for the welfare of her boy, Willie. Along with her many letters, she would send my dad packages of food, packets of Kool-Aid to make his water more drinkable, copies of the local newspaper, and at one point a raincoat. She worried if he was eating enough. Was he losing weight? Was he cold? Was he receiving communion, etc.? Years later, she would confide in my own mother, her daughter-in-law Carol, that she had been haunted during this time by the specter of a soldier in dress uniform standing at her doorstep, telegram in hand. Of course, she wasn't the only one to be tormented by such a vision. She would correspond with other mothers in the area whose sons were in Vietnam and would often inquire if Will knew where this guy was or where that guy was, and where exactly was he, because all of the fire bases and remote outposts mentioned in his letters were not shown on the maps of Vietnam that were published in their local newspaper, and may well have been the worst year of her life as well. One thing my dad always mentioned in his letters was all the other people who were sending letters to him. I was surprised by this, and it was comforting to realize that there were so many people thinking about him at home. He may not have been as alone over there as I'd previously believed. Something to keep in mind about the letters, of course, is that they tend to focus on the day-to-day life of a soldier, his personal thoughts, and questions over what was going on at home. With a few notable exceptions, they don't tell us in any great detail about the battles fought or the most terrifying of experiences. Some soldiers would, in fact, write at length about such things in their letters, but usually not in the ones addressed to their mothers, for obvious reasons. He did write at length at times about the constant rain and their inability to ever get dry, which brings up something else that's important to remember. To look at each of the photographs taken by my dad and his friends, one would get the impression that it never rained in Vietnam. Well, their cameras were typically kept in a small waterproof plastic bag in their rucksacks and only taken out when weather permitted. It's also worthy to note the great effort that was required to get these pictures developed back then and how many were forever lost, their film damage from excessive moisture and heat. When I was a kid, I considered my dad to be rather worldly. He had traveled to exotic places and fought in a war. He was a scuba diver and had been an astronaut at one time. As a construction worker walking on narrow beams high above the city, he helped build what is still the tallest building in Minneapolis, the IDS Tower. An electrician by trade, but also an amateur inventor and photographer, he is well-versed in astronomy and an expert chess player. He can play both the guitar and the accordion, a jack of all trades. He works on his own cars and builds things, and creates all manner of electronic gadgets. I later realized that he actually hadn't been an astronaut. The photos on our basement wall were actually of Neil Armstrong. Nonetheless, I still thought of him as a Renaissance man. By those who know him, he is regarded as a man of great integrity who can always be counted on to lend a helping hand. I remember more than one occasion when he had corrected a store clerk for giving him too much change or had forgotten to charge him for something. Whenever someone is in need, he is typically the first one to volunteer to help. I can recall him stopping to assist stranded motorists on the side of the road, once giving a ride to a woman with 2 kids walking along the highway in the winter. The one thing he's never been in any situation is a bystander. Today, he still spends many hours fixing and installing wiring in homes of his friends and family and in our local churches. Although he may not have been as straight-laced and responsible as he is now, his own words in his letters home demonstrate how his basic decency and regard for human life have always been cornerstones of who he is. Through all the death and brutality he was exposed to, it should be regarded as no small achievement that he always managed to keep this part of his character intact. It is now May of 2018 as I finish writing this prologue. As mentioned before, in March of this year, I took both my mom and dad to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. We had no idea what we would find there. We were hoping to find documents relating to my dad's company during their time in Vietnam. What we found were the battalion's daily staff journals and situation reports for every day of the battalion's first year in Vietnam. It was the final piece in the puzzle of sorts, detailing exactly where each company of the battalion was located and what happened on each of these days. The reports and journals illustrated exactly when and where many of the stories and events I had already written about actually took place, while bringing to light many other events I had not been aware of, some of them humorous and others rather morbid. We spent 4 days methodically scanning and taking pictures of thousands of documents, and one day visiting the monuments in Washington, D.C. After our return home, I began sifting through the documents we had captured. Reading through each of the reports and journals was mostly mind-numbing and tedious, but every so often another piece of the puzzle would appear to help bring this story together. I had put off making the trip to the archives until after I had practically finished writing this book. Reluctant to travel so far with no guarantee of what we would find, it turned out to be a trip very much worth taking.